I've given you a chapter to read that is more recent than some of the other readings from the book that I wrote about this for talking about questions of public policy. In the book, I have a couple of chapters, one on, I call it control, but really censorship, and the other on privacy. And it's not so much that it's a big set of reading to kind of fit into our tight schedule here. That's part of it, to be honest. But the bigger part of it is that this is one area in the search environment that's changed fairly rapidly recently. This chapter is newer, but even the moment that I stopped writing it, it's a little bit out of date, but at least it brings things closer to the present in terms of what's going on in that space. So I will briefly go over three areas that maps somewhat to the way the chapter talks about it. The first is this question of censorship. The second is the question of privacy. And the third, the area that's changing a bit more, is this question of, say, monopoly or trust busting or something like that, right? A lot of the concerns recently have been about how you can break up big social media or big business online. So let's start with this big one. First one, the question of censorship, or the big question that kind of circles around all of this, search engine bias, right? And throughout, we've talked about this issue of bias being a really bad word to describe this, because search engines are biasing engines. We want them to act as censor. We do not want to see everything there is on the internet. That's why we go to a search engine. Otherwise, we just kind of browse through the internet itself. So when we go to a search engine, we are looking for a certain kind of bias. But we're looking for a bias in favor of what we want to see, not necessarily determined by either the search engine and what they think we should see, or by countries or businesses that want to influence those search engines and influence what we should see. So there's two pieces of this, right? One is that we're going there for the bias, but we want that bias to be a bias that is in favor of us, not in favor of any other actor. Now, the idea of governments being involved in censoring, in stopping certain information from being available, is a very long one. In fact, the word index, which we've kind of established as one way of looking at search engines as an index for the internet, the word index comes from the index of prohibited works, this kind of list of books that you were not allowed to read according to the Roman Catholic Church. So this idea of having an index that stops you from seeing, not just helps you find things, which is what we think of an index as right now, but also stops you from finding certain things, is really long-standing, much longer than the internet itself. So what do governments not want you to see? The example people immediately go to is the ways in which the People's Republic of China has placed a certain amount of government influence on what search engines can show. Arguably, one of the reasons that it supported companies like Baidu, and actually a number of other search engines in China, is because they were looking for search engines that would be more amenable to the kinds of controls that the Chinese government places on search. So there are things that the Chinese government feels are not acceptable for the average searcher, either in China or outside of China, to have access to. They would prefer that you did not see criticism of the government or of the party, for example. They would prefer you were not searching for events that were that portrayed the government of China in negative ways. Or this would include things like their treatment of, well, more recently, their treatment of religious and ethnic minorities, either in Tibet or in other parts of the country, right? This would include things like historical events like the protests in Tiananmen Square. So these kinds of things they don't want on their search engines, to the extent that they will stop companies from operating in China if they allow those things to come through. This, in the case of Baidu, is a little bit easier because they've received some support from China itself, and a large number of internet users in China. And so one of the reasons that Baidu kind of ranks as a bit of a competitor within very limited markets, to be honest, but a bit of a competitor with Google, is because they have a very large number of searchers within China, and it's geared to the Chinese market, or at least the Chinese language market, if not the PRC market. So in the case of China, we have some fairly extensive involvement in the search, and there's a long history, which I won't go into here, of China sort of saying Google can only come in if we have access to their indexes. This goes into privacy as well, but also in terms of what they search for. And Google saying no, then we'll be out of the Chinese market, and then eventually coming back and saying we don't want to be out of the Chinese market. We'd rather have a presence there, so we're willing to play ball. A lot of that is repeated in a number of different contexts, where Google ever originally says, well, then we'll just take our stuff and go, but eventually uses that bargaining position to find its way to a negotiated settlement with local authorities. And that's the case of China and a number of other examples as well of countries that have said these are things that we don't want to see. So although China comes to mind as the first, in part because it's so large, in part because it tends to have a fairly, I don't want to say draconian because that's not really fair, but a very extensive engagement in censoring, especially political information. That there's a tradition in the United States called the Michelgonian tradition of thinking about the freedom of speech being especially important in terms of political speech, and that's clearly not the case for the Chinese, where they're perfectly willing to say that if your political speech is contrary to the party, then it doesn't necessarily need to exist on the internet, right? But China's not alone in this. There's lots of examples where governments have involved themselves in various ways in saying this shouldn't show up in the search engine. You might say that, for example, there have been efforts to say, okay, well, for example, certain biases around race, ethnicity, gender, sort of our better angels should be represented in the search engine rather than our existing stereotyping and, frankly, bigotry. And in many cases, because the search engine reflects what people produce on the internet, it produces a great deal of bigotry in its search results. So whether it is reinscribing this bigotry, whether it is kind of reinforcing it by representing it representing it in the search engine, or whether it is whether it has a role in trying to undo these processes is a fairly large question, right? And I think an important one. And so, one of the early examples of this was that a search for Martin Luther King would, for many years, the first hit on that was from a white supremacist group, right? And Google said, we're not going to change that. That's the way that's the way our algorithms judge what is most important. Now, why the question then is, okay, then your algorithm's broken, right? So if the first result for looking for information about the life of a civil rights leader is to go to a site that's been produced by a white supremacist group, then the algorithm's broken. You either need to fix this particular instance, which is what they eventually ended up doing, although they're loath to do that. They're loath to go in and play an editorial role and change it, because really what that represented was a failure not just in this one instance, but if that's what your algorithm thinks is most important, then there's something wrong with your algorithm. That you can say that's reinforcing existing bigotry within the country, but that is not the mainstream view of this particular person's life, right? And so there was this, I think, a valid uproar about why this came up as a search. For most people, they would have some kind of editorial view of what they find on the internet, but especially young people would be searching for Martin Luther King, and this would be the first result. And it didn't come out and say, welcome to Stormfront, this is an evil person. It was more subtle than that, so that people could get tricked into this idea of having a subtly racist view of this civil rights leader, right? You could say that this is replicated in very small ways, kind of across the web. So there is that interest in providing a better view, a more, I guess we could say, editorial view of what's out there. This comes to play in things like fake news, in good scientific information. Does the search engine have a role to play here in finding the stuff that is of high quality, and correct, truthful information? Now, some will tell you that there is no truth, that we're in a post-truth society, whatever. But this continues to be kind of a question. And from that initial question of what biases do I want that come to me, that are in my favor, I don't want you presenting fake information to me, right? I don't want you to present to me lies. So certainly in that respect, that's a bias that I want. I want you to get rid of the flat earthers, unless I'm specifically searching for flat earthers. That's a little tricky. I want you to get rid of bad scientific theories. I want you to kind of give me good, solid information. And so is that a bias? Is that a set of censorship? Yes, it is. But again, that's in my favor. So I want that to happen. I'm bouncing back and forth here a little bit, but we've taken China as one extreme example of the government determining what should be acceptable or good stuff to see. But there are varying levels of that in every country to a certain degree. So one of the examples early on for Google was whether you could search for Nazi either ideas, those published by Nazis, for example, or paraphernalia, shopping, that kind of thing. All of that is illegal in parts of Europe that were under Nazi control or that were influenced heavily by Nazi occupation. So Germany as the big one, Germany and Denmark have been the two that have ended up having, I think, the biggest conflicts with Google over this, because it is national law. You can't, when you present this sort of thing, you violated the law. And so, again, this process happened as it did with China, where Google said, well, that's what the search engine is, take it or leave it. And eventually they said, okay, we can see if you're searching from these countries. And if we are, we can apply some of these blocks on it. Now, where that stops is an interesting question, but certainly they've shown that they are capable of saying certain search keywords and outcomes we can censor out of our search engine for the purposes of national governments. In the US, we also have this. I think the US tends to be on the very liberal side of allowing for you to see lots of things. We don't have hate speech laws, for example, in the US, and we haven't. We have hate crime laws, but not hate speech laws. So you're welcome to be as racist as you want on the internet without having any legal encumbrances to that. As a result, the government has never gone in and said, for example, in the Martin Luther King case, Google, you must do this by law. And I think, at least in the near future, that's fairly unlikely. But there is one class of material that is strictly forbidden in the US, and that is in obscene material. And that is generally the easiest way to get to obscene material is explicit child pornography. Actually, any kind of child pornography. We have a long kind of court history of saying that, any putting of children in a sexual light is going to be censored. I should say not censored, but illegal, right? And so even if you run into this stuff, the common defense for those who have been caught with child pornography is, I was doing research or something like that, right? And none of that holds water. As soon as you see an image, and it usually is image, text in the US has gotten pretty significant protection, but as soon as you see a depiction, an image, a video, or something like that, shows up on your computer, even if you were not searching for that, even if you were not looking for that. Now, honestly, this is fairly uncommon unless you're looking through pornography already, or unless you're somewhere like the deep web, which, frankly, I have in other courses encouraged you to go and take a look and see what's out there. But that's with that large caveat, which is, if you stumble upon something like this and it shows up on your computer, it does not matter that you had no intent of getting that material. It is a felony. You've committed a crime by doing that. And so that in the US is a fairly clearly straight drawn line. And as a result, search engines have to censor that material, right? They will be involved in a crime if they do not censor that material. So although this is a fairly, I don't know, I would consider it a fairly small or minor area in which censorship happens in the U.S., it would be wrong to say that that we are a free speech country and that for us as a light of liberty in the world that we encourage open. We do around political issues, but there are certain things that are still forbidden in the U.S. by law. In fact, that leads to one of the first bad policy decisions by the U.S. government to try to censor the internet. This is the CDA, the Communications Decency Act. And there's a long history to this of a badly done study that was not peer reviewed, that was then picked up by Time magazine, that then got a cover story with a very sensational image on the cover of Time, that then got picked up by a bunch of Congress people who made really bad law. And if you've seen some of the hearings around Facebook and other things, these are folks who are not generally particularly literate when it comes to internet communication, and so they made bad policy. And one of the problems with policy for the internet is that frequently it tends to be bad policy. So there's that whole sweep of things. One of the pieces around censorship has not to do with things that are forbidden to say, but who's allowed to share that material. And so a lot of this runs around copyright. This is especially pressing now when more of the material that you see through Google is actually hosted by Google. Google is stickier, to use one term, than it has been in the past. When you do a Google search, you might see part of a Wikipedia page that pops up and gives you the blurb of the answer you actually wanted. So you never actually go to that site. A lot of these complaints came around image search, that you were seeing the images on Google image search, and so you never went to the site that actually owned the image. And so there were a number of law cases in the United States, and now there have been around the world, around issues of copyright. Again, this generally tends towards images and video rather than text, but it also has shown up in terms of text, especially for the Google Books project, for example. Who owns that once you scan it? Who owns it once you've indexed it and represented it? Is there a fair use, which is a particular US doctrine which says that you can do certain things with copyrighted materials? Are you allowed to do that in order to index that material? And so one of the ways that censorship or control or government policy has come to questions of content is to address these issues of copyright. Those issues are more pressing in countries that do not have that history of fair use. Even in the U.S., this is kind of an open question as to whether certain uses are allowable. But outside the U.S., even more so. So we've had, for example, in Europe, questions of whether Europe and now Australia and other places as well, questions as to whether Google or Facebook or others should be able to link to or provide some kind of context to articles that are published by journalists. And journalists think they should be paid for that work, that you should be, Facebook, for example, reached in the United States an agreement with many publishers that said that they would pay them if their work was being presented in Facebook. In Australia, you had this issue with both Facebook and Google about questions of whether you should be paying newspapers for providing. So from the Google's perspective, whether you should pay newspapers for telling customers how to find them, which sounds very strange, but from the newspapers' perspectives, whether Google should be sharing in some of their huge revenues for basically making money off of representing work that journalists have done. So those are the two sides of that coin. So I'll stop there in terms of just kind of censorship broadly. No, I won't. I lied. The other place that Google censors that's really kind of important is this way in which it censors sites that it thinks are bad players. So generally, people refer to this as the Google death penalty, that you can be delisted from the site. Now, I've been delisted, my site has been delisted from the site on multiple occasions. Generally, it's because I got hacked and people were using my site to basically link farm. And in those cases, Google said, you have a bad site, you're leading people to bad, to other bad sites. We're going to delist you. And it actually can be kind of a hard, once you clean that all up, it can be kind of hard to climb back out of that hole. So in that case, I think they have a valid reason for saying we're very wary about sites that have been hacked or that seem to be engaging in something that is deceptive towards users. So that's one way you can get knocked out. But also, and this is a little bit more controversial, on a number of occasions they've said, we do not like the type of SEO you're engaged in. So one of these cases is kind of link farming, where you pay people to link to you, and there was actually a very large national retailer who had a New York Times article about how they had successfully done this, and a day after the article came out, suddenly they weren't available on Google search. This kind of death penalty seems like it's a bit of of course, exaggeration to call it a death penalty, but for businesses, it is a death penalty. There have been a couple of suits around this, lawsuits around companies that have hired a company to do SEO. That SEO is engaged in practices that Google does not like. Generally, again, this is an issue of link farming rather than anything else, although there are other things that you could do that will likewise get you in hot water, including things like, delivering different pages to the Google crawler than you do to actual users, and a bunch of other, doing things like trying to make your competitors look like they're engaged in bad practices so Google delists them. All of these kinds of dirty tricks for Google. If Google catches wind of them, which they may or may not, they may decide that you are now persona non grata or company non grata on the search engine. And that kind of death penalty means the death of, especially depending on your type of company, can mean the end of your company. Like, it's day and night. For companies that have been delisted, they suddenly lost all revenue sources overnight. Like, people just, they had some return customers, but most of their business was done by people searching for them and finding them. You can think of certain cases of this. For example, local, if you're a plumber locally, you may rely on referrals, in fact, but a lot of that is people searching and saying, I need someone now, right? There was a diamond retailer, there's other cases here where people have kind of been blacklisted from Google. And since Google's the only game in town, if you're blacklisted from Google, it's like being knocked out of the town square. Nobody knows who you are. You've been shunned by the internet. And so there's a question as to whether, and the other piece of this is that this is largely arbitrary, right? Google, in my case even, where I've been delisted, it's sometimes hard to get a good hold of why Google has done this. In these other cases, they've just said, we don't like the practices you're engaged in. We won't tell you what they are, but you're gone. And they're a private company. They have the right to do that. So that's the other form of censorship where Google itself inflicts a certain amount of influence. And honestly, it's not transparent. So it's hard to know whether, for example, if you write a criticism of Google, whether that is something that Google might decide needs to either be nixed, which would be very obvious, or whether it would get knocked down in the ratings, right? And so, that there's something to that. I may link to an article that I wrote about this, a very short one. But there is this question of whether Google's influence is, because of its lack of transparency, in this very small area, even though I think it happens fairly infrequently, is particularly onerous. Okay, that's too much on censorship already. Let's talk a little bit about privacy. Should we be concerned about the privacy of what we search for? And the answer is, of course we should. Some people have suggested that the search engine itself is an index of wants or needs. That this is something that I think the question over Google flu trends was overplayed, and I think we've now seen that it's not the best indicator we have of whether flu is spreading. Another effort was made along these lines for COVID as well, but it is an indicator, right? If you see a spike in people searching for, cold remedies or something like that, you can kind of trace how the flu is spreading over the U.S. or how COVID is spreading over the U.S. by figuring out what people are searching for. In many cases, if you look at someone's search history, and this is obviously has become a starting point for a lot of forensic investigations, either for white-collar crimes, but also for things like murders. If the day before your spouse disappears, you're searching for how to hide your spouse, how to bury your spouse without anyone ever finding them, suddenly it suggests that you had a certain motivation and that you may be involved, right? So I don't think that's a concern most of us have. I certainly don't. Yes, I promise. So, that's not a concern most of us have, but at a very small level, it does kind of reveal our desires, our interests, our questions, right? There's a whole book about the sexual side of this, like what people search for when they're searching for sexual materials, either on somewhere like Pornhub, but also on somewhere like Google, like what your search reveals about your desires. So I think that is one of those big interests that we have in kind of protecting. AOL at one point had its own search engine and released a cleaned log of people's searches. What they said was an anonymized log. And what they did is they went through basically with a regex and removed all phone numbers, addresses, proper names, something like social security number, which strangely people will put into a search engine. So they went through and cleaned out what would be considered personally identifiable information of some sort. And then they released that as a download for researchers to get access to. And lots of people, myself included, downloaded this immediately saying, wow, this is really a great resource for figuring out what people search for and how they search for them. And then 2 days later, the New York Times ran an article about how easy it was to re-identify these people based on this. They actually went and knocked on this poor grandmother's door somewhere in the South and said, hey, we have your search results here, because they tracked back by just kind of triangulating the kinds of things she'd searched for and found an individual through that process. And that wasn't that hard to do. And then there were the creepy ones where you had something like, what to do, how can you trick the government into arresting your boyfriend? And like this, because they had the sequential histories, they had these really interesting kind of life stories. And there were actually websites set up to trace these. And you might want to kind of go and look through these, because it's an interesting, it would be a great form for a novel, right? A novel through someone's search history, because you kind of have, where do I get my nails done? And then what kinds of poisons work on humans? It's like this really weird set of increasingly scary search items as people go to Google. So should those be protected? And this has come up very recently, or relatively recently, I should say, in a number of cases where governments have been given access, not necessarily directly, but for example, in the case of Ukrainians doing searches, Google knows what Ukrainians search for and what their IP address is when they search. This may be somewhat disrupted by new access technologies, but generally speaking, Google has a record of these things and knows what, in this case, Ukrainians were searching for. They didn't then provide this directly to the Russian military or to the Russian government, but they did provide it to advertising companies in Russia that had direct ties to the Russian government. So this is true strangely, it's not as true in the United States. And a number of people have argued that we need people that are like this, kind of both in the case of Russia and in the case of China. You have hacking groups that are either quasi-governmental, that is, they may get funding from the government, they may be hired by the government, or they may just be patriotic. It's always a little unclear. There's some plausible deniability there. But in the case of this particular organization, it was a quasi-governmental organization. And so, Google is basically feeding them targets. They are involved in warfare and providing intelligence to an organization and a government that has been condemned by the international community in many cases. So that's not the only case of that. Facebook had a similar case in cases of spreading, contributing to genocide, right? So these are pretty extreme examples of how privacy isn't just a matter of, I don't want advertisers to know what I'm looking at. I mean, I think we've all had that example of the shoe that is stalking us. Like, I went and looked at this shoe, thought I might be interested, decided it was too expensive, and then for the next 2 or 3 months, it shows up on Facebook, it shows up on Instagram, it shows up on ads on newspapers. It just kind of stalks you, right? And so that kind of invasiveness feels a little icky, but it goes much further than that. So, should we have some level of protection of what it is we search for? This is also the kind of, a lot of this came to the fore again with some of the NSA spying issues. That is, even though it's not directly related to questions of search, but more broadly what you're doing on the internet, search is certainly a central part of that. And so, when the U.S. government is spying on its own citizens, should it have clear access to the Google search results? And I think that although there are examples of companies that have been very resistant, including Apple, to kind of providing the government access to this stuff as their patriotic duty in some way, most companies are very willing to say, okay, yes, we're going to share this to stop imminent attacks. We don't want to be on the wrong side of history on this, so we're going to provide this to the government. So we have those kinds of questions around whether that material should be available to authorities, I guess, or to companies. Or beyond that, to the public. So there is an emerging right to be forgotten that is encoded in European law now, and also in Californian law to a much lesser degree. Once you turn 18, you can request that your records be expunged from public sites from before you were 18. So it's a limited thing there. But in the European case, you can basically say, no, Google, when you search for me, I do not want results about me at all, or about me in a particular incident, although generally it's about me and all, right? So you can say, I want to disappear from Google, and under European law, Google has to comply and say, yes, you're gone. If someone searches for your name, they won't find you. Now, if you think even just for a minute about this, you understand how convoluted this issue is. What about people who have the similar name? How do you determine which one's about which person? There's all kinds of issues around this. And so I think that's going to play out in interesting ways going forward. But there is at least this initial idea that we should have the right to say, I don't need to be found, or these things about me don't need to be found. And that we have some degree of control. We should have some degree of control over that. All right. So we'll leave that aside, even though privacy is a huge, huge issue that we could talk about forever. But I want to move on to this last piece, which is the question of kind of busting up the monopoly of search. So although I don't want, it's really hard to get away from the idea as Google being synonymous with search, it is by far the largest market holder in terms of search in the world. It's easy to forget that there are these other search engines. And in some cases, it's, something like Yahoo is actually using the Google search engine. So when I say that, I'm including these kinds of rebranded or refaced search engines that are basically using Google search results to drive their traffic. So I think that anytime we see that concentration of economic power, it is concerning. And there's two pieces to this. One is I think Google is a natural monopoly. If we had 5 Googles, we would increase the amount of traffic on the internet exponentially. We would have 5 times the amount of traffic on the internet, because the majority of traffic on the internet right now is crawlers going out and looking for stuff, either Google or other crawlers, but largely Google, right? So because if we increase the number of search engines, we'd increase the number of crawlers linearly, and we'd have just a huge increase in traffic. We would have, frankly, a global increase in the amount of production needed for silicon and for chip making, the largest computational, acres of computational technology are used to produce the Google search results. And so, and just enormous amounts of electricity, tremendous amounts of electricity. So every time we do that, we'll duplicate it to what end? The point here is that I think Google is probably a natural monopoly, that it makes sense to have one search engine. The difficulty with that is the issues of control and of profit and of being able to say we don't, and transparency, all of these issues that come with that. But in terms of the actual technology itself and the economics around it, it does make sense to think of Google as a natural monopoly, a monopoly that makes sense to be of its own. When we have other natural monopolies historically, although not more recently, but historically in the United States, we've said that's a really good case for public ownership. And there are a number of critics, including, a whole bunch of critics who made the case for a public search engine. And the idea that if not kind of government takeover of Google, that a government alternative to Google as a kind of natural monopoly should be established. That has gotten very little traction in the United States. Outside the United States, there have been efforts that have died, frankly, of making national search engines. A lot of people say, if you're in France, and France and Germany were the two that actually paired up and put some money into trying to build search technologies. There is a very serious concern around whether you really want an American company providing the search results for you. This was China's issue, and one of the reasons they supported an indigenous search companies, right? Indigenous efforts at producing their own search. In the case of France, Google is an American company. Why should they be indexing everything in France? Why should they decide what's important to the history based on what? And we don't know, right? The algorithm is secret. So there is this feeling that from a lot of national governments that they wish that they could have their own search engine as well, something that better serves their citizens, right? And some of those efforts have been national, and some of them have been just supporting private development of search. So there is that question of monopoly and control. That question has come, I think, to the fore much more so in the last several years. And this is where I've been a little bit surprised, frankly. I had not anticipated that, especially in the European context, that Germany in particular, and then Europe as a whole, both through the GDPR and also through a new law that the Germans have brought up around libel, for example, that they are actually being able to say to Google in particular and to Facebook and to some of these other large platforms that we should have a say in local governance over what you produce and the kinds of excesses that you engage in, where you just kind of say, well, it's the technology and we're Americans, so we can't be held by your laws. That kind of rhetoric from especially Google, but also from Facebook, has run into some serious concerns. Facebook has pushed against this, has seen, I think, especially in recent years, the largest pushback in terms of their, and it's not around kind of social networking, right? It's not around who you can friend, although that's part of it. It's some of the things we've talked about. It's whether they're producing a bias in what they present to you in terms of filtering, and then whether they are sharing your private information. And there are bigger issues around this, but those are the two really big ones. And governments have stepped in and said, we should be able to say something about that. The tradition in the US is when the government steps in, industries try to self-regulate. In the case of privacy, they've created this global board that has some theoretical separation from Facebook's operations and can judge on whether they have correctly censored someone or not. That's the majority of their cases, or whether something has been, something has been removed by Facebook. And then it goes, for example, someone showing a nipple has been, removed by Facebook, and it goes to the board, and the board says no, this is kind of an overreaction, and that questions around breastfeeding or cancer should not be lumped in with pornography and erotica, right? And so, the board makes a decision. They get they've had over 1 million appeals to the board, and they've only kind of made decisions on about 68 of them. But like the Supreme Court, and that's the way it's often framed, is this is kind of the Supreme Court of Facebook with a international group that includes kind of former prime ministers and journalists and a fairly broad and interesting coalition of folks who are sitting on this board. That they are supposed to act as kind of an internal check on Facebook. It remains to be seen how effective that will be. This was again, to bring Ukraine up again, in the case of Facebook, they initially went to this board and said, can you give us a ruling on whether we should suspend our rules around spreading information about violence in the case of the Ukrainian war? Can we actually allow people to have calls for violence against the Russians because they're an invading force? So they initially asked this question kind of publicly of their oversight board, and then they quickly pulled it back and said, we don't want your answer on that. So there's definitely some tension there. There's some question as to whether it has any kind of real bite at all. But that's one effort to kind of forestall some of these governmental intrusions on how people do things and how they decide what gets shown and what doesn't get shown. I think over the next 5 years or so, this will be a very hot topic. That governments will be interested in both questioning whether someone like Google should have 95% of the market or 99% of the market, depending on how you determine the market, or whether that's a classical example of a trust that needs to be busted apart or that needs to be nationalized. I doubt the latter will happen in any of these cases, but it may. And like I said, I have underestimated how much determination there is to kind of check some of these excesses. So that's one area. The other area is this question of fairness and of the spread of fake information and how much public policy should be involved in that. And I think we're going to see some movement on that as well. It won't be huge, but it will be slow and it will have some effect. And then the last is this question of privacy. And I do think that we're going to start to see more and more, again, the Europeans have taken the lead on this, but in the US, California and New York and some other states have started to say, okay, we're kind of getting a vision of what this should look like and are putting in new privacy protections and also some questions over whether search engines should present certain things in certain ways. And so we're starting to see the very start of the edge of that. I will go back to when the telegraph started up, there was something called the ITU, the International Telegraphy Union. I'm not sure I got that right, but the ITU, which was based on actually issues around making sure that when you went across Europe, all the train tracks were the same width. Because if you got to a national border and they decided to be a couple of inches wider, that's a problem for train travel. And so the idea was that this should be similar for telegraphy. You should have the same lines. You should have the same codes. There's never been an internet police. There's never been, even though we have kind of some very lightweight organs of internet governance, there's never been a government in the sense of a controlling authority for the internet. And so for that reason, it's been very hard to have regulatory policy that applied to it. But I think we're seeing this new model of certain states, of places like Australia or New Zealand, or especially Germany, taking up a set of codes and saying, we can have from a national perspective, we can inflict these codes on you. And then rather than what you might worry about, which is lots of other governments coming up with their own version of this, a lot of them take that as model and then apply it locally. And so I think we're starting to see this kind of spread of regulatory concerns. And in the US, when California does things like fuel regulations or other kinds of regulations, often it spreads to the country, because it's easier for a company to follow those regulations everywhere than just make a California car. They still make California cars, but then just make kind of regulations for California. And that's true especially for things like the internet, where you have to use HTTPS, you have to use SSL, secure servers, when you're handling private information by California law. So if you're already doing that for California, you're going to do that nationwide or globally. And so I think we start to see this kind of networked approach to how regulation fits together as a puzzle. And once enough countries adopt some kind of similar language around something, I think we'll start to see that become kind of default universal. And so I think that's the most exciting thing happening in terms of policy over the next few years, and something worthy of watching. Okay, thanks.